Really happy to be here. It's an interesting time for agriculture. I'm going to speak a little bit about things close to my space that are impacting all of agriculture, some parts more than others. And of course, today we're talking about flax. Um, you know, these connections are pretty strong for a few reasons. Of course, there is this connection of growing different crops on the same field, that type of connection. We can't grow two crops on the same field. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of things happen in the biofuel space, which are impacting vegetable oil and oil seeds and crush, and things that we might not be familiar with, but really do have a big impact on the situation we face. And just kind of expanding on that a little bit, what we've seen in the last 5 years, especially, is a dramatic increase in biofuel production. Most of this recently has been supported by a policy that the state of California has, the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, LCFS. That's created a market for low carbon fuels. And it just so happens that a product called renewable diesel is really the best fit for that. And so we've seen this dramatic increase in production capacity and production of renewable diesel in the last 4 or 5 years. And now looking forward, we're really looking at something called SAF, and that's sustainable aviation fuel. So essentially, jet fuel that is low carbon. And typically, when we talk about it, we're talking about being made with biomass and usually vegetable oil, or it can also be made with ethanol. So again, we've already seen this renewable diesel build out. We're in the early stages of the SAF build out, and it's impacting agriculture significantly, especially on the vegetable oil side. And so if you can think about these connections, obviously we get oil from flax and other products, but this is where this big biofuel connection comes in. Uh, Renewable diesel and SAF today are made almost entirely with vegetable oil. And this has caused two things. One, we're obviously using more material in order to produce those new biofuels. And then we're also seeing this pull on crush. And so crush is this term. So a crush plant that first and oftentimes multi process facility where we're going to crush the oil seed and typically refine it to some extent. And so we've had this increased demand for crush across the board, and it impacts flax without question. So first chart that I'm going to show to you is from the Department of Energy. This is increased vegetable oil use for biofuel production. And really the thing I want you to take away from this is just that increasing trend. So we're going from what's about 30 million pounds per day, about 4 million gallons of biofuel, and essentially doubling that in the last 3 years and a couple months. And so, I mean, it's really tremendous to see that grow. Of course, much of that has come if we break it into the big components. Soybean oil use has increased quite a bit. Corn oil a bit, and then canola oil has kind of been holding its own. All three of those are also used for making biodiesel, which is still produced, but it's really the growth in renewable diesel where we're seeing this increase in use of vegetable oil. Looking at production by year, and this is vegetable oil production, so not the oil seed itself. This would be at the crush plant. So after the oil seed's been crushed, this is how many pounds of vegetable oil we produce. We've seen that steadily increase over the last decade or so. The biggest increase on its face to date has really been corn oil extraction at ethanol refineries. But we see this increasing steady pace. And as you see the blue on the chart, don't get that conflated. That is cottonseed. Flax ends up being a very, very small part of this bigger picture. And in fact, we're in hundreds of millions of pounds, not even really the billions of pounds place with flax. But again, the idea is we have all of this vegetable oil being produced, and that's putting demand on both acres, going back to the oil seed, as well as on crush and refining, the actual physical plants where we, separate the oil from the rest of the oil seed and also have meal, hulls, or other co-products. One of the first things to get across, I've already touched on this a little bit, is that with this increased demand for biofuel, we've seen pretty much all parts of agriculture benefit to some extent. There's increased demand for these oils. There's increased demands for those oil seeds. There's increased competition at the acre level of what's going to be planted. And so that ends up transmitting itself into land prices themselves, but also into the price of, those many competing economies. In one way to think about this, and this is one of the two bigger points, as that demand has come on, prices generally have risen. And as long as some of those product prices have risen faster than land prices, farmers are typically going to be better off. The other thing that happens in terms of use is that we are using more vegetable oil generally for biofuels and overall, and that with that, prices have gone up for those products specifically, and it's within those products and then additional attributes on top of those where we can get higher values for specialty oils, the flax, the safflower, and such, which can be beneficial as well. Here's a chart that I use every once in a while to communicate this trade-off between value and market size. And it's unique for flax. And so I typically use this when I'm talking about something like corn ethanol. And so corn ethanol, when it really came online about 20 years ago, the idea was we were going to have so much supply that we needed a home for it. And, basically any home would do. We did not want it to go to waste. And, producing fuel seemed like a great home because it's one, very, very large. In this case, it's at the bottom of that pyramid. Unfortunately, its value typically isn't that high. And the saying is, and as an economist, I use quite a bit, a fuel is a chemical cheap enough to burn. So we found in corn ethanol, this fuel and this feed purpose, there's still interest in other things. And now with decarbonization, that fuel might be even more valuable, might even bump off feed, changing this a bit. Flax is different if we think about the component parts and the typical markets that flax products go into. Already higher on the chain, not going into fuel, will likely never go into fuel. Meal going into feed, obviously, but food markets, specialty products, smaller markets, but higher value markets, and it tends to match things up pretty well. And again, thinking about the rising tides, thinking about the major commodity oil seeds, in North America with soybean and canola, they're primarily in that food and feed place and a little bit going into fuel. And then, as this price has gone up for all, the price of these in generally have gone up, but it's also pushed up that value typically for that specialty product. So that spread between a flax and a soybean, might shrink a little bit, but it does move up. That flax price does go up. Kind of reiterating that with this slide, you can think about vegetable oils being, they're rarely perfect substitutes or even close to that, but they have a lot of similar characteristics. Those characteristics have different values in the market. We know and we've seen over time, breeding and different activity to bring some of those characteristics to market. Taking an oil seed that might not have been fit for human consumption or desired for human consumption into that space. Now we're seeing more boutique type things with certain types of profiles in the chemistry, commanding higher market value. And so, as we have this increased demand for biofuels, that's going to eat up the common commodity oil seed. Those that have these unique characteristics, will continue to command some sort of market premium. And then again, that's especially the case for a niche, smaller market, high value oil or oil seed like flax. One of the things we talk about a lot here in agriculture, including the Midwest and more so in North Dakota, or at least we experience it more in North Dakota, is this idea of a battle for acres. And so as we see the price of crops change, we see the competitiveness of certain crops, kind of enter the fold or exit the fold. And so we do see these giant shifts in acreage, at the state level in North Dakota, at any given farm, The combination can vary, somewhat from year to year. Pushing back from that biofuel thing all the way to the farm, we've seen somewhat higher oilseed prices, definitely support for all prices. But again, when that price comes back, it's going to push things back or forth. At the same time, the demand for oil is going to push everything up. So the price that farmers are going to see, you're still going to see uh, a competitive enough price for smaller crops to get the acres that they need. And again, this movement back and forth, and especially this time of year when companies and processors, marketers are putting out contract prices for the year or forward prices for the year. They're trying to make sure that they can get the supply that they want and need. And in this case, getting oil seeds, is no different than that. What is different and what a lot of folks miss is that once the oil seed leaves, there's also a battle for processing. And so we have limited, I mean, it's actually a significant amount, but there is a certain amount of crush capacity in the United States and refining capacity in the United States. Um, Not all of it is perfect substitutes. We have crush plants that are designed for soft seeds, some for hard seeds for soybean. And so we can't really go, too far back and forth between these. We have to have crush available in order to get the oil. And so, example of this, we go back just a couple of years, 21, 23, we saw this huge increase in vegetable oil prices. And the increase in vegetable oil prices wasn't meant at the time to increase oilseed supply. They didn't want that necessarily to go back to the farm level so you produce uh, more of a particular type of oilseed. They were actually using that price to pull existing already harvested oilseed through processing. This was because the biofuel folks, the folks making renewable diesel, they needed additional supply and they wanted to make sure it was soybean oil. So they bid up as much as they could to make sure that it was the soybean going through the processing facility as opposed to anything else. And this gets relatively interesting. We've seen a dramatic build out in soybean processing specifically. We've also seen some of those facilities are multi-seed crush plants, so they can handle other oil seeds like flax. But we do still have to some extent, especially looking forward, a potential bottleneck in making sure that we have enough capacity to crush the different types of oil seeds, knowing that there's going to be kind of changes in supply and changes in demand for those. And there's definitely questions of, do we need to build more crush plants, especially in the northern plains, the US or Canada? And the answer to that is probably yes in a few years. We've seen this build out of soybean crush capacity in the United States. Canada has done essentially the same in Canada with canola. Uh, we have all of these other oil seeds that also need a home. They had a home. They're still finding a home. They're still getting to market. But if we continue to see that increased demand for biofuel for vegetable oil, we need to make sure that we have the right combination of crush across the system in the United States. Moving over to the kind of the other side of things, and this hits flax in some ways uniquely. Right now, there's a lot of efforts underway to decarbonize the economy. That's changed to some extent here in the United States with the change of administration. But we do have governments, industry, others who are creating a system where low carbon products or activities that decarbonize the economy are incentivized. And so this is economy wide, but with greater attention to agriculture, in part because we have such a huge face towards the environment, how we work with the environment compared to all other industries. And this decarbonization thing, broadly speaking, can be about reducing emissions, and it can also be about removing carbon dioxide from the air. And then this is somewhat unique in agriculture. Different practices can result in organic carbon being stored in the soil for some period of time, and that's getting a lot of attention. Generally speaking about what this means to agriculture, at a high level, it means interest in more biofuel production. Again, these biofuels have a smaller carbon footprint than gasoline or diesel or jet fuel. So that's one reason why they're wanted. We're also seeing interests not from the biofuel side, from the food side, the fiber side, all of these other uses of ag products, where corporations, especially, are being driven in some cases by regulation, in other cases by just trying to get ahead of regulation or where they think things are going. And they're doing various things, creating a system where, incentives may be provided for changing production practices or changing input use, being the two bigger pieces. And again, for agriculture, this would include something like reduced or no-till, and then possibly using less fertilizer, using low carbon fertilizer, using something that increases the efficiency of fertilizer. One of the things that flax has an advantage over many other crops is where we do produce it. We're in a place where we do have reduced no-till and the like. It fits there, and so that means compared to other products, it usually starts out with a smaller carbon footprint than most of those competing oil seeds. This is also important, and again, more on the food side, is the expected uh, importance of the carbon footprint of a crop in terms of actually having access to a market and then the possibility of charging a premium. And this is really looking not here so much in the United States, but primarily to Europe, as they're creating a system both in a regulatory sense as well as in terms of being a market for these goods. Um, Thinking about flax specifically, again, we have some things where this hits well on the production side. And obviously, flax farmers are not just flax farmers. They're going to be producing a number of crops, managing that, multiple fields year to year and such over time. Their agriculture, including in North Dakota, is and will be hit biggest by the biofuel demand, but the decarbonization side for certain products, especially those that are high value consumer products like flax is for some uses, they're going to have a bit of a bigger pull compared to other crops. And so we can see, the product that I have is already an organic labeled product. There are some who will, you know, be willing to pay more for a label like that, would be willing to pay more for a label that might say something like low carbon, which in general, most flaxseed meal probably already is. One question is how much are consumers willing to pay for that, and how many of those consumers are there? Truth is, it's a small number of consumers who will grab certain products like this or pay a premium for them, at the grocery store. Instead, what we really expect is that we'll see regulation demanding this, beginning with folks having to report what the carbon footprint of their crop, an intermediate product, or even a consumer product, and then eventually getting to the point where we want smaller carbon footprints, or you must meet certain thresholds for carbon footprints. And that's something that is part of policy in the European Union, is policy in the state of California, although they've kind of kicked back their regulation for a little bit. And even in the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is part of the federal government, they had a proposed rule just a few years ago to require reporting as well. They actually stepped back on that. At the same time, American companies that do business in the EU, which is many of them, they're going to be required to report their carbon emissions. And because that report has to be honest, as required by good business as well as by law, if an American company reports to the EU, the numbers have to be good. And that's almost as good as saying that the federal government is requiring them to report their emissions associated with any product and all the way along that supply chain. And so that's hitting many companies right now, and especially anyone who does business at scale in Europe. They're already hit, and that's going to get the number of folks who are going to be regulated is going to increase very quickly in coming years. And then California is going to be doing the same thing, for in many cases, for better or worse. One of the last things I want to talk about, been in this space for a long time, and there's been a lot of interest, over the years, and it still remains for different biomaterials. And there's a question why these things don't become commercialized relatively quickly. What we see in general is this challenge of having supply at scale all the time. And so that becomes an issue. And really, one of the best examples of this is the auto industry. The auto industry, especially in Europe, is very interested, and they do use biocomposites. So that would be a combination of biomass and plastic. They do that to some extent. They would be willing to do more, but they really do need that scale, and that becomes challenging for a new industry. It's also interesting because we have different types of natural fibers that would be competitive. What's interesting is flax is in some cases the natural best fiber or a very competitive fiber, and we do have that at some degree of scale. I work and talk to a lot of folks who want to bring hemp fibers to scale, and it's like, well, sure, if you can make that work, great. But it's interesting that we have something that's already available. And at one time certainly had various markets for that fiber, still does for certain uses, but that there's this additional opportunity still kind of sitting out there. So those were my prepared remarks.